Deep in the forgotten heart of a Texan pine forest, far from the beaten paths and the echoes of city life, lived a man named Ernest Clay. He was known as the loner of Broken Timber County, a rugged, weathered man with a stare that could split wood and a silence as thick as fog. His days passed in solitude, chopping firewood, fixing his old cabin, and avoiding the ghosts of his past. But everything changed the day he stumbled upon a half-collapsed shack and found a little girl sewing by the dying light of a candle. Her eyes were too big for her face, her hands too small for the needle, and yet she stitched like her life depended on it. Maybe because it did. This is a story about second chances and bloodlines lost to history, about a girl bearing a star-shaped birthmark and a man haunted by a family torn apart. It's about how fate sometimes speaks in whispers through the trees, and how even the most broken souls can find their way back home. Prepare yourself for a journey across the plains of grief and the mountains of redemption, told one chapter at a time. The Star of the Woods is a modern Texas tale about belonging, destiny, and the healing power of quiet, stubborn love. The woods didn't speak unless you knew how to listen. Ernest Clay did. He could hear the cracking limbs when a deer stepped lightly across the frost-covered pine needles. He could sense a storm hours before the first cloud bent over the tree line. But what he heard that day was different, the kind of silence that presses against your chest like grief. Ernest had been walking the eastern ridge of his property, far beyond where the fence had given up years ago. He wasn't looking for anything, not really. His axe rested across his shoulder, and his boots broke a slow rhythm over the roots and dead leaves. The pine trees leaned in overhead like quiet witnesses. He hadn't spoken to another human in almost a month. The townsfolk in nearby Bethel Springs gave him a wide berth, which suited him just fine. The only company he ever needed was the weight of the axe in his hand and the fire in his hearth. But even the most reclusive soul can't outpace the ache of emptiness forever. That day the wind blew in strange, cold but carrying something else. A scent, smoke maybe, dust, memory. It tugged at something in him that had long been buried. He turned east, where the trees thickened and the sun barely touched the forest floor. There, hidden behind a tangle of blackberry vines and half swallowed by moss, stood a shack he didn't recognize. Ernest knew every trail, every stump, every stone on this side of the county, but this place wasn't familiar, not in the usual way. He stepped closer, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The door hung off its hinges, swinging with the wind. From inside came the faintest sound, not rustling, not breathing, but the rhythmic tug and pierce of a needle through cloth. He pushed the door open. The inside smelled of rot and cold, but in the farthest corner, seated on a stool worn down to one leg, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 10. Her hair was tangled and tucked behind her ears, her dress no more than patches stitched together by desperate fingers. But what caught Ernest's attention was her hands, raw, red, relentless. She didn't look up. The candle on the floor burned low, casting long shadows. She worked in silence, sewing a tiny dress that looked fit for a porcelain doll. Ernest's voice surprised even him when he finally spoke. "Why are you here alone, girl?" She didn't flinch. "Ain't got nowhere else." Her voice was thin but steady, the kind that came from someone who'd had to grow up too fast. "What's your name?" "Star," she said. "Is that your real name?" She shrugged. "That's what my mama called me. Said I had a star right here." She tapped her forehead, and there it was. A birthmark shaped like a five-pointed star, slightly faded but unmistakable. Ernest felt a sudden tightness in his throat. He had seen that mark before, long ago, on a hospital bed. On the soft skin of a child he was told had died. He took a step back. The wind pushed against the door. Star looked up finally, her eyes the color of dusk after a long storm. "You ain't gonna take me back, are you?" "Back where?" he asked, though the answer terrified him. "To the folks who left me here. They said I was trouble, said I talked to the wind too much." Ernest didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the broken table and set down the tin of jerky he carried with him. Then he turned to leave. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "Don't go nowhere." She nodded, already back to sewing. As he walked into the trees, the sun finally broke through the canopy, and for the first time in years, Ernest Clay felt the warmth not just on his skin, but in his chest. The wind howled through the trees that night like a wolf circling something sacred. Ernest Clay sat by the fireplace, staring into the orange glow as shadows danced across the log walls. His boots, still muddy from the trail, rested on the worn-out rug, and the smell of pine smoke clung to his beard. But it wasn't the storm outside that unsettled him. It was the storm inside. He couldn't shake the image of that girl, her hunched shoulders, her bleeding fingers, that strange mark on her forehead. Every part of her looked like she didn't belong to this world, like she'd been borrowed from a fairy tale and left behind. But she was real, realer than anything he'd felt in a long time. That night he didn't sleep. He sat there listening to the wind talk to the trees, wondering what kind of man left a child alone in the woods with nothing but thread and memory. Morning broke pale and grey. Ernest packed a satchel with food, a spare wool blanket and a flask of sweetened tea. Something inside him, something old and buried, told him he wouldn't be just visiting this time. He might be bringing her home. When he reached the shack, she was where he left her, but something had changed. She looked at him like she'd been waiting her whole life. "You came back," she said. "Promised I would." She stood slowly, stiff from the cold, and pointed to the corner. "That one's done." On a folded piece of cloth lay a tiny dress made of torn lace and ribbon scraps. It was beautiful. Not because of the fabric, but because of the hands that made it. Ernest nodded. "You ever been to school?" She shook her head. "You know how to read?" "A little. Mama taught me before she didn't wake up." Her voice didn't crack. That hurt Ernest more than if she'd wept. He looked around. The place was beyond fixing. The roof sagged like a broken back, and the floor smelled of mildew and animal droppings. "Pack your things," he said. She frowned. "What things?" He realized she meant it. She had nothing, so he took her hand. They walked together through the woods. She didn't speak much, but her fingers clung to his like she was afraid the world would vanish if she let go. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was high and warm, and for the first time since he'd built the place, Ernest opened the door for someone else. "Bathroom's out back. Water's from the pump. I'll make stew," he said. She didn't answer. She was staring at the walls, at the books, at the small guitar hanging near the window. "You play?" Ernest blinked. "Used to." She walked over to the guitar and strummed a single wobbly note. It was out of tune. She didn't mind. He made stew. They ate in silence. Later, he spread the blanket on the couch and gave her a pillow that hadn't been touched in years. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He thought about lying. He thought about saying because it's the right thing or because you need it. But instead, he said the truth. "Because you look like someone I lost." She didn't press, just nodded and pulled the blanket over her shoulders. That night, she slept by the fire, and he sat in the rocker watching the flames. He still didn't know who she was, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting her go. A week had passed since Star came to live in the cabin, and the days had slipped into a quiet rhythm. Mornings by the stove, afternoons under the pines, and long evenings where the only sounds were the snapping fire and the scratch of her needle. Ernest never said much, and Star didn't ask many questions. They understood each other in the way only two lonely people could. But peace, like autumn sunlight, rarely lingers long. It began with a set of footprints. Ernest had gone out to check his traps. A few were strung along the edge of the North Ridge, where raccoons and the occasional fox liked to wander. But that morning, there were boot prints in the mud, not his, not Star's, and too deep for a passing hunter. He knelt beside them, fingers brushing the edges, heavy, fresh, heading toward the cabin. Back at home, Star was on the porch brushing the hair of a handmade doll. She looked up as he approached. "Someone's been out here," he said. She stiffened. "Who?" "That's what I aim to find out." He didn't want to scare her, but his gut twisted with unease. Someone knew they were out here, and they'd gotten close enough to leave tracks near his land. That night, Ernest didn't sleep. He kept the shotgun by his chair and the lantern burning low. Star fell asleep on the couch, one arm draped over her doll, the other over a book he'd started teaching her to read. But Ernest watched the door like it might breathe. At dawn, he saddled up his old horse Dancer and rode into Bethel Springs. The town hadn't changed. Same gas pumps, same rusting sign over the post office. He passed the diner and the feed store and headed straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Mike Reynolds, thick-necked and slow-moving, looked up from his desk with the suspicion of a man who rarely got visitors. "Clay," he said, "what brings you down from the trees?" "Someone's been on my land." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Poacher?" "Don't think so." "Too careful. Got close, too close." The sheriff leaned back. "You think it's got anything to do with that girl?" Ernest didn't answer. That was answer enough. Mike sighed. "You know I can't just go arrest shadows, but I'll ask around." "Do more than ask," Ernest said and turned to leave. When he got back to the cabin, Star was standing by the porch rail, arms crossed. "Someone was watching us last night," she said. He froze. "What makes you say that?" "I saw eyes, just past the trees. They glowed like glass in the firelight." He checked the perimeter. Every tree, every trail, found nothing. But that didn't mean no one had been there. That evening, he set traps of his own, not the kind for raccoons. Motion bells, fishing line, and a tripwire that had set off an old tin can full of nails. Nothing fancy, just enough to hear someone coming. At midnight, it happened. The can went clattering down the side of the hill. Ernest was off the couch before the second bounce. He grabbed the lantern and the shotgun, slipped out the back door and circled the trees. No one. But near the base of the pine, he found something. A strip of cloth caught on a branch. Black, heavy, government issue. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning he knew two things. Someone was watching them, and they had resources. Star sat on the porch, eyes on the trees. "Is it someone from before?" she asked. He sat beside her. "Might be. I won't let them take me again." He looked at her, startled by the steel in her voice. She was 10, maybe, but she had the eyes of someone who'd fought wars in her sleep. "You won't have to," he said. "I promise." And that night, for the first time in years, Ernest Clay prayed, not for forgiveness, for protection. The next morning was colder than most, the kind of chill that makes bones ache and spirits retreat. Ernest stood on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, his eyes scanning the tree line. Star was inside, reading the same storybook for the third time, her lips moving silently with each word. She was learning fast. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no wind. Just a silence that felt loaded, like the moment before a storm breaks. Ernest walked the perimeter again, and that's when he saw it. Symbols carved into the bark of 3 different trees, faint but deliberate. A triangle, a series of dots, a spiral, none of them familiar. He showed them to Star that afternoon. Her eyes widened. "I've seen these before," she whispered. "When I was little, on the inside of the shelter they kept us in." "Shelter?" She nodded slowly. "It wasn't a real place. No signs, no name, just cold walls and whispering doctors. They said we were special, but we weren't. We were just different." Ernest felt his gut clench. How many kids? 12, maybe more. Some didn't stay long. He didn't press. She was shaking now, so he wrapped the wool blanket around her and lit the fire. That night, while Star slept, Ernest opened the trunk at the foot of his bed, the one he hadn't touched in 15 years. Inside was a leather-bound journal with his late wife's name stamped on the spine, Lena Clay. He hadn't read her notes since the accident, but now, page after page, he followed her handwriting through grief, confusion, and desperation. She had been investigating something before she died, something about missing children, altered birth records, and a research group called Novus Aurum. And in one entry, dated exactly 1 year before the fire that took her life, she had written, "There's a girl. I saw her. She has the mark." Ernest stared at the words until they blurred. Star wasn't just any lost soul. She was part of something his wife had died trying to uncover. The next day, Ernest went to the county archive. The clerk barely looked up as he requested property records and medical licenses for Novus Aurum. Most were missing, redacted, burned. But he found one thing, an address, a cabin leased under a fake name, way up near Red Hollow Creek, Star's old shelter. When he returned home, she was waiting on the porch. "I saw someone again," she said. "In the woods, just watching." "We're leaving," Ernest said. "Tonight." She didn't ask why. She just packed her things, all of them, which fit into a single pillowcase, and followed him to the truck. As they drove through the dark pines, the air grew heavier, like it held its breath. Star leaned against the window, her fingers tracing stars in the frost. "Are you scared?" he asked. "A little. Me too." They reached Red Hollow around midnight. The cabin was empty, rotted through, but the basement door was padlocked. Ernest broke it with a crowbar. Inside was a long tunnel lined with faded tiles and fluorescent lights that flickered even without power. And on the wall, freshly written in chalk, were the same symbols from the trees. They weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. The tunnel smelled like bleach and old secrets. Ernest held the flashlight steady, the beam cutting through the dust like a sword. Star walked behind him, one hand on the back of his coat, the other clutching a small cloth bundle, her comfort, her anchor. The air thickened as they descended. Every footstep echoed, bouncing off the concrete walls with unnatural clarity. At the bottom, the tunnel split into 2 hallways. The left led to darkness, the right to a steel door half ajar, its lock hanging broken. They chose the right. Inside was a room lined with empty beds. Each had a number stenciled on the frame, each mattress stripped to the springs. On the far wall, clipboards hung in rows. Ernest approached them, brushing off the dust. "Patient Ero 7B, one read. "Subject demonstrates pattern recall beyond expected range. Birthmark confirmed." He flipped to another. "Patient 09F, non-responsive to commands. Transfer to deeper unit recommended. High risk." Star sat on the floor, her knees to her chest. "This was where they made us sleep," she whispered. "No pillows. Lights never went off. They said it was training." "Training for what?" She looked at him. "To forget." A sound interrupted them, a creak above, like a door opening. Ernest moved quickly. He shoved a cabinet against the room's entrance and pulled Star to the far corner, hiding behind a storage rack. His breath slowed. He counted every creak, every footstep. Someone was upstairs, and they weren't alone. Star closed her eyes. Her lips moved. At first, Ernest thought she was praying, but then he felt it. The air changed, warmer, lighter, as if the room had exhaled. A second later, the footsteps paused, turned, and retreated. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low. I don't know, she said, but they felt me. They stayed hidden another hour before slipping back outside. The woods were silent again, but not in peace, in waiting. Back at the cabin, Ernest spread the files he'd taken from the clipboard across the table. Diagrams, DNA sequences, maps of brain patterns, and at the bottom of one, a name. Dr. S. Halberd. He knew that name. Dr. Silas Halberd had been the head of pediatric neurology at Pine Bluff General Hospital 20 years ago. He disappeared after a malpractice scandal involving unauthorized trials on orphans. Ernest remembered the headlines, and now Starr was living proof the experiments had never ended. The next morning, he drove into Bethel Springs and used the library's ancient computer to search through archived court cases. Most were sealed, but one article, tucked deep in a scanned newspaper, listed a land purchase near Devil's Creek under a trust fund registered to Halberd Holdings. He circled the address. That night, as Starr helped stack firewood, Ernest handed her a flashlight. Pack light. We go at dawn. She didn't ask where. She only asked one thing. Will there be answers? I hope so. And as the fire died down to embers, she whispered, Then I'm ready. The sun had not yet risen when Ernest and Starr reached the edge of Devil's Creek. The water cut a black ribbon through the landscape, and on the far side stood an old Victorian house, shrouded in vines and leaning slightly, as if the earth itself wanted to forget it was there. They crossed the creek over a narrow, moss-slicked bridge, Starr clutching Ernest's hand tightly. The closer they got, the colder the air became, not from wind, from memory. The door wasn't locked. It groaned open like it had been waiting. Inside, the air was thick with mold and silence. Faded wallpaper peeled like shedding skin, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning. They moved slowly, flashlight beam darting from portraits to dusty furniture. One room had children's drawings tacked to the walls, crude stick figures with stars on their foreheads. Another was filled with rows of filing cabinets, each marked with codes and numbers. Starr paused before one cabinet. This one, she said, her voice barely audible. Inside were photographs, charts, test results, and a file labeled Subject 09F. Starr. Ernest opened it. It contained her birth name, her blood type, observations about emotional detachment and empathic resonance. See? Starr said. They wrote, I didn't feel anything, but I did. I just couldn't show it. Ernest's jaw tightened. They lied. In a back room they found a generator. Ernest rigged it to power the lower floor. Lights flickered to life, and something else did too. A screen. Static at first, then a logo. Novus Aurum Initiative. A voice crackled through an old intercom. Visitor access unauthorized. This property is protected by federal bioethics law. Please vacate. Ernest stared at the speaker. We're not leaving. They continued exploring. In a narrow hallway they found a locked door labeled Observation Wing. The key hung on a chain behind glass, next to a photo of a young Dr. Halberd. Starr broke the glass with a chair leg. He doesn't get to keep secrets anymore. The door opened to a long corridor lined with one-way mirrors. Behind each pane was a small cell. Some had toys, others had hospital beds. All of them were empty now, but Ernest could feel the stories inside them. One room had 09F scratched into the paint. Starr stepped in without hesitation. She touched the wall like it might remember her hand. I used to sing in here, she whispered, so I wouldn't feel alone. Suddenly the lights flickered. Footsteps echoed above. Ernest grabbed her hand. We're not alone. They moved quickly, exiting through a side stairwell that led back to the main floor. In the foyer, the front door creaked again. A man stepped inside, clean-shaven, thin, with eyes like rusted steel. Dr. Halberd, Ernest growled. Mr. Clay, the doctor said calmly, you've stumbled into a legacy you don't understand. Starr stepped forward. I understand enough. You're a miracle, Halberd said to her, one of few who survived. Ernest moved between them. She's not your experiment, Halberd smiled. No, she's the future. And from behind him, two more figures appeared, armed, silent. Starr's eyes narrowed. I remember them. They were the ones who took the others. Ernest reached for his revolver, but Starr lifted her hand. The lights exploded. The walls groaned. A gust of wind roared through the house, though no windows were open. When it cleared, the men were unconscious. Ernest stared at Starr. What did you— I don't know, she said, but it listened. They ran. Back at the cabin, they locked the doors and sat by the fire. Ernest held her close. Her heart raced. So did his. What now? She asked. We find the others, he said, and we end this. The dreams began the next night. Starr had barely closed her eyes when the images came, quicksilver flashes of places she'd never seen or perhaps had forgotten. A red barn, a blue windmill, a circle of standing stones half buried in sand, and then a sound, a voice calling her name, not from the air but from inside her own mind. When she woke, the images were so vivid she could draw them. She did, on parchment, with a charcoal stick from the hearth. Ernest watched her work in silence, his coffee growing cold. "Are you sure you've never seen these places?" he asked. "I think I lived there," she said. "Or someone like me did." He studied the markings. One stood out, a tree with a split trunk and a hollow in the shape of an eye. "I know that tree," Ernest said. "It's up near Panther Ridge, about a day's ride." By noon they were packed. The journey was long, winding through old ranch trails and past forgotten cemeteries. When they reached the tree, Ernest placed a hand on its bark. "This used to be a meeting point," he said. "Before the developers came, a lot of truth passed under this tree." They found the hollow. Inside was a metal box wrapped in oilskin. Star opened it. Inside was a photograph. 5 children. One of them, unmistakably, was Star. Another was a boy with the same star mark on his forehead. "My brother," she whispered. There was also a key and a note. "Bury the past and it will rise angry. Face it, and it will guide you." The note was signed only with the initials LC. Ernest's chest tightened. Lena Clay, his wife. Star stared at the sky. "Why do I remember things I never lived?" "Maybe you did live them," Ernest said, "and someone tried to erase them." They returned home, but Star continued to draw. Each night, new dreams. Each day, new maps. Her mind was a compass, pointing towards something unfinished. One map led them to an old shelter, hidden in a limestone cave near Redbrush County. There in the dark, they found names etched into the stone. Children's names, some crossed out, others followed by a date. Star found hers. Underneath, in shaky handwriting, "Still here." The air grew thick. She collapsed. Ernest carried her back to the cabin, heart pounding. That night, as she slept, her hand glowed faintly, just the outline of the birthmark, pulsing like a beacon. When she woke, she said only one word: Arkwood. Ernest had heard the name before. A ghost town swallowed by the government in the 90s, a town where, according to whispers, children disappeared. He grabbed a pen. "We're going," he said. She didn't flinch. "I know. They're waiting." Arkwood was a name spoken in whispers, the kind of place old men in diners talked about only after midnight, when the coffee had gone cold and the sky was too dark to feel safe. Ernest and Star crossed into the forgotten town just as the sun broke through a storm-heavy sky. The streets were overgrown, buildings slumped under decades of wind and rain, and the silence was not peaceful, it was watchful. The first thing they saw was a sign nailed to a leaning telephone pole: "Restricted, property of the federal government. No entry without clearance." Star traced the letters with her fingers. "They always claimed it was toxic waste," she said. "But it wasn't." Ernest nodded. "It was memory, buried under concrete." They found the schoolhouse first, its windows shattered, desks still arranged in ghostly rows. On the blackboard, faint chalk letters spelled, "We remember." Star sat at the teacher's desk and closed her eyes. This was where they lined us up, gave us numbers, said names didn't matter. In the back closet, they discovered boxes of old VHS tapes, labeled by subject number. One of them, 09F. Star's hands trembled as she pushed it into the battery-powered player Ernest had brought. The screen flickered. A grainy image appeared. A girl, maybe 6, sitting in a metal chair. Her arms were strapped down, her eyes wide. A voice asked questions. Her answers were clear, calm, but chilling. "I see more when I sleep," the little girl said. "I can feel other hearts." Then came the worst part. A second child entered the frame, a boy with the same mark on his head, her brother. "Project Gemini," the voice said off-screen. "Watch what happens when they're near each other." The children reached for one another, and the screen went white. Star shut it off. "They separated us," she said, "because we were stronger together." Ernest took her hand. "We'll find him." They searched the town for hours. Most buildings were empty, decayed, but the town hall still stood. Its door, unlike the others, was locked with new chains. Inside, they found a control room, files, power banks, a functioning radio station that someone had tried to hide. On a table was a folder labeled Gemini Protocol. Current status, 1 confirmed, 1 unknown. "Me," Star said. "I'm the 1 confirmed." Ernest opened a second folder, "And I think I know where they sent the other. Coordinates. A camp in New Mexico. Remote, militarized." Ernest turned to her. "You ready for a fight?" Star smiled, not like a child, but like someone who had finally remembered her strength. "I was born ready." They left Arkwood as the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of 1,000 forgotten voices. New Mexico was a landscape of wind and silence, where the earth cracked open under relentless sun, and secrets could bury themselves in the sand for generations. Ernest and Star followed the coordinates to a patch of land surrounded by chain-link fence and crowned with rusted towers. The sign read, "Federal Agricultural Testing Zone. No trespassing," but it was no farm. Inside, rows of metal buildings stretched like scars across the desert. Cameras blinked from poles. A buzz of static played over unseen speakers. It felt more like a fortress than a lab. They waited until dusk, then cut the fence and moved like shadows. Star led them, her instincts sharpening with every step. "There's someone here," she whispered. "Someone like me." They found a hatch under one of the sheds, locked with a retinal scanner. Star placed her hand against it. The door clicked open. Below, the air was cold and artificial. Lights blinked in sterile rows above a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and metal. Star moved quickly, past empty chambers and observation rooms, toward something she felt in her bones. Finally, a door marked Subject 09M. Inside was a boy, 14 maybe, same star-shaped birthmark. Same eyes. He didn't flinch when they entered. "I knew you'd come," he said to Star. "Do you remember me? Not everything, just the pain and your voice." Ernest stepped forward. "We're here to take you home." The boy looked past them. "They won't let you." A siren wailed. Red lights bathed the corridor. Guards poured in. Men with rifles, men in black. But this time, Star didn't hide. She stepped into the hallway, eyes glowing faintly, and raised her hand. The walls shuddered. Light exploded. Sound cracked like thunder. And when the dust settled, the guards were unconscious. The boy, her brother, stood beside her. "I can do it too," he said. They ran. Ernest led them through the maze, out into the desert, where the stars watched from above. He didn't stop until they reached the truck, until the lights of the facility were no longer visible. Only then did Star speak. "I don't know what we are," she said. Ernest started the engine. "You're children, survivors, and you're not alone anymore." They drove through the desert night, 3 shadows against the moonlit dust, together at last. The road home was long and silent. They crossed state lines under the veil of dawn, gravel kicking up behind Ernest's truck. As the forest drew near once more, familiar pines, heavy with morning mist, and the scent of firewood clinging to the cool air. Star sat in the back seat with her brother, now known simply as Micah. He didn't speak much, but his hand never left hers. The silence between them was its own language, shared pain, mirrored strength. When they reached the cabin, Ernest parked and stepped out slowly. The woods felt different now, less like shelter, more like waiting. Inside, everything was as they had left it. Firewood by the stove, Star's sketches stacked neatly, the rocking chair creaking slightly from a breeze, but Ernest knew better than to think the quiet meant peace. That night, Micah dreamed. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, whispering the same phrase over and over. "They're coming." Ernest sat up. "Who?" "The others," Micah said. "The ones they trained. Not like us. Worse." By morning, the signs were clear. Branches snapped where no wind had blown, tracks in the mud that ended in clawed impressions. The forest itself trembled. Star prepared. She sharpened old tools, packed supplies, traced symbols in the dirt near the windows. "They won't stop," she said. "Not until they've buried the truth again." "Then we don't let them," Ernest replied. The final confrontation came under a red moon. From the edge of the trees, 6 figures emerged. Tall, cloaked, eyes glowing faintly. Children, but twisted by years of forced training. They moved like one, circling the cabin. Micah stepped forward. "You don't have to do this." A girl with silver hair hissed, "It's all we know." "Then learn something else," Star said. The battle wasn't fought with fists, but with force. Mental, emotional, elemental. Lights flickered, trees bent. The air cracked with energy. Ernest held the cabin like a fortress, fending off those who breached the walls. In the end, Star stood at the center of it all, her arms outstretched, her mark glowing like a sun. She spoke a word none of them understood, not in language, but in feeling. And the forest responded. The ground shook, roots rose. The twisted children fell, not in defeat, but in release. When it was over, they were gone, not dead, changed, freed. Micah collapsed beside her. Ernest caught them both. "You did it," he whispered. "No," Star said, eyes closing. "We all did." The stars above flickered as if in approval, and in the woods, for the first time in decades, true peace returned.